This video partly presents a set of totally autobiographical and personal reflections, and it's partly making a broader political point, or at least raising a question I've never really heard anyone else raise. Are people maybe becoming a little bit more racist and a little bit more credulous in relation to the seemingly magical significance of DNA, ancestry, and bloodlines? Because, on the one hand, people are having smaller and smaller families. They have fewer brothers and sisters they can compare themselves to. And on the other hand, we have the progress of DNA technology being available to the general public. People can now send their drop of blood to a laboratory and be told all these magical and mysterious things about their past. In the long term, I think these are really powerful forces shaping self-perception and the political conception of bloodline, lineage, so on and so forth. Simply having fewer brothers and sisters, it would be difficult to exaggerate the impact that has on Western culture. I've known a couple of people in my life who, like myself, had parents gave birth to, conceived an enormous number of children. My father had 9 kids. And when your father has 9 kids, you grow up constantly confronted with both the meaningfulness and the meaninglessness of DNA, of shared ancestry, shared heredity, what have you. So when I encountered someone like Isaac is a YouTuber, his YouTube name is Ask Yourself. When I encountered someone like Isaac, who was for about 2 years sincerely fascinated by different kind of racist theories of DNA and IQ, theories about how racial groupings reflect different levels of intelligence. And I'm not insulting him here. I'm just saying he found this literature fascinating. He found this way of thinking fascinating. And he'd come on his Discord. Again, this went on for about 2 years. There were hundreds of witnesses, thousands of witnesses, because these were large discussions involving large numbers of people. He would come on and he would denounce people who disagreed with him as quote-unquote biology deniers. I think only neo-Nazis use that kind of verbiage, and a lot of people took him aside and said, "Look, Isaac, you may not know it, but you're picking up some key terms here from the kind of fascist fringes of the political spectrum. Other people just don't talk this way about the relationship between DNA and intelligence." So for a kid like him, he comes on the internet and he encounters this sort of fully fledged discourse about race and the heredity of intelligence. And some of it seems, at least at first glance, academically respectable. And he's not really reading the books. He's not really doing research into this in a deep way. He's responding primarily to YouTube videos about it and his own kind of logical free association. So his point about being a quote-unquote biology denier was as follows. He'd claim, look, height and athletic ability, all these things, all these genetic predispositions, they're not equally distributed around the globe. So therefore, if you dogmatically assert that intelligence is equally or randomly distributed around the globe, then you're in denial about biology. Now, of course, this is linked to a philosophy that is, in my opinion, overtly racist and racialist. But there's an implicit contrast here just to being someone who grew up with 8 brothers and sisters who have nothing in common with you, and who above all else do not share the same level of intelligence and do not share the same type of intelligence with you, do not have the same kinds of affinities and interests and talents that you do. So even my brothers and sisters who are my half brothers and half sisters, I normally don't refer to them as such, but these are children my father had with women other than my mother. I have more in common with them genetically than I could ever possibly have with someone else who shares the ethnic category of Jewish. I have infinitely more in common with my half-brother, any one of them, than I could ever have in common with somebody else who historically their family has been defined as Jewish for, let's say, 500 years, who happens to bump into me on the street of New York City, and we start having a conversation and say, "Oh, you're Jewish? I'm Jewish too." By the way, religiously, I'm not part of the Jewish faith. We just mean the ethnic category. And that kind of thing does happen to me from time to time. In Victoria, just before we left Victoria, BC, Canada, west coast of Canada, me and my girlfriend both, we struck up a conversation with a guy in a coffee shop. And I would have never guessed, based on appearances, that he was Jewish. And amusingly, he also didn't guess, based on my appearance, that I was Jewish. I think I do look pretty stereotypically Jewish, but whatever. Anyway, moving beyond these kinds of physical resemblances, the idea that when I meet this guy, I feel some kind of deep kinship, and specifically an intellectual kinship, that I think we've inherited the same intellectual potential, that's a very, very tough sell for someone like me, partly just because I have so many brothers and sisters. Now, I can remember debating in parallel with people in Cambodia. This happened in Cambodia, not in Laos. In Cambodia and Laos, both those countries were just making the transition from having large families, everyone having large numbers of brothers and sisters, to having smaller numbers of brothers and sisters, families having just 2 or 3 kids in total. That demographic shift was happening while I was there. But there still were the fully grown adults who were walking around. A lot of them came from families that had like 11 kids. And of course, they'd say something to me like, "Well, my parents had 11 kids, and today 6 of them are alive." That kind of thing was not uncommon at all in Cambodia and Laos when I was living there. But I can remember debating with someone in Cambodia, someone who believed in astrology. So let's be clear, we don't here mean the European tradition of astrology, but an Asian tradition of interpreting when you were born, under what year and what positions of the stars, that this tells you something about the person's intellectual character, their mental attributes. I remember saying, do you really think you have something more in common with someone who was born with this star sign, let's put it that way, born with these stars aligned, than you have in common with your own brothers and sisters? And I pointed out, look, you have so many brothers and so many sisters. How much do you have in common with them? And the person I was talking to, they thought about, I already knew them well enough. Really nothing. Really, this person was quite alienated from their own family. We were talking in English. And it was how many of your brothers and sisters even wanted to learn English? I'm talking to a Cambodian person who made a huge effort to get fluent in English and take on the kind of career she took on. How many share your interests in research and politics and all the other things that created the conditions for us to have this conversation, obviously. And the answer is not at all. So why are you willing to believe that you have all these things in common with somebody just on account of the position of the sun or the position of the stars at the moment they were born? And you wouldn't have that in common with them if they'd been born 1 month earlier or 1 month later, whatever the scenario will be. DNA appeals to a very natural sort of ego trip in the same way that astrology does. It appeals to a sense of specialness on the basis of things that are arbitrary and things that can be tested and falsified, And there's a reluctance for people to let go of the ego trip and to let themselves question, test, and falsify those claims or those ideas. Now, conversely, I have the situation with my relationship with my own daughter. My daughter has spent very little time with me since she turned 1 year old. So during the first year of her life, I was with her all the time. But of course, she can't really remember that. Most of us don't have a lot of memories in the first year of our lives. And then after I split up with her mom, I've seen her for just a few weeks here and a few weeks there on a court-appointed schedule. So the similarities I have to my own daughter in attitude, and I mean, these are not just striking to me, but my mother has also met my daughter at various times. And it's kind of amazing that when my daughter was like 2.5 and 3 years old, she was saying things and behaving in a way that was shockingly similar to myself when I was a small child. And we all knew she didn't get these behaviors from imitating me. And she definitely did not get these behaviors by responding to the same kinds of circumstances. So, I mean, I grew up in Toronto, Canada. I grew up in Ontario, also Ottawa, a few places like that, not worth mentioning. I grew up in Ontario, Canada, speaking only English with two parents in bizarre circumstances. And my daughter grew up with a single mom and her grandmother in the south of France. And she grew up during those years speaking French and German and English, English in the mix. A totally different school system, totally different culture, totally different era. And you have these unbelievable similarities of character. You know, obviously, we resemble each other in appearance to some extent, too. I can see the heredity that way. So, I mean, it's very appealing to want to believe that these characteristics are hereditary. But you see the fragility of what this belief is based on. There's nobody else on this earth I can really have as much in common with genetically as what I have in common with those two people mentioned, my own mother and my own daughter. And yet at the same time, you have to be able to appreciate the alienness, the distance, the unbridgeable gulf between you and this other person, the difficulty of feeling that you'll ever know them, that you'll ever understand them, and they'll ever understand you. I'm going to end this video by directly answering the challenge that Isaac put to me, that Ask Yourself put to me, summoning up the context both of my own family experience, the sense of extreme alienation I have when looking at who my brothers and sisters are, who my own parents are, that I have so little in common with them, with all these different examples of how more or less the same DNA plays out, and then the strange sort of kinship and similarity that I can see in my own daughter, given that personal context and given also the political context that I've conjured up to some extent, that the world is a changing place, partly because people have access to DNA tests, also even just computerized databases showing what their family history based on government records and that sort of thing. People have access to that personal history as never before, and that's going to have political ramifications as never before. In that context, then, is my position what Isaac would characterize as being a quote-unquote biology denier? Am I dogmatically asserting that what people perceive as intelligence or what people measure as intelligence is completely non-hereditary, or do I believe it's completely hereditary, or something in between? Well, I think it's really important in this case to answer a question with a question that challenges the presupposition of how substantive and palpable this thing called intelligence really is. What if I told you that I had a dream last night? I mean a dream in the literal sense of a kind of hallucinatory, visionary experience while I was sleeping. I don't mean a dream in the sense of a plan or an aspiration or a career. Let's just say I had a dream last night, and I tell you this whole dream, and whatever, various surreal things happen in this dream. And then I told you that I'm certain I had this dream because my father had the dream before me, and my grandfather had the dream before that. And let's just say you replied, what are you talking about? Did your father tell you that? I said, no. Did your grandfather tell you that? No, we never talked about it. We never had any conversation about this dream. I'm just sure that dreams are hereditary. You would reply and say, that's crazy, that's insane. How could you leap to this conclusion? Well, what we're talking about when we talk about intelligence, especially fully formed intelligence in adults like myself, I'm 40 years old, it is on the one hand something that resembles dreams and something that is produced by dreams, that you have a dream and you then act on it and pursue it. It's into the realm of such, impalpable and fleeting things that rest in a very uncertain way on such crude and simple facts of biology. Now, the counter-argument, I've said this many times before, is the extent to which intelligence really does rely on having good vision, good hearing, good health, not being retarded, not being mentally impaired, not having an impairment like dyslexia that prevents you from developing in a certain way because it prevents you from reading. So I should say that about visual impairment also. If you have poor vision, then your ability to read is impaired and it's more effort for you and so on. If you have poor hearing and it's just harder for you to listen to a lecture or listen to an audiobook for this reason, these are all things that are going to constrain and direct the development of your intelligence the same way they will constrain and direct your ability to drive a car. Now, if my daughter has a dream that she can get ahead in women's wrestling as a sport, that will lead her, if she pursues this dream, to develop her mental and physical capacities in a whole different direction. And she would probably end up being the type of teenager and the type of adult that has relatively little in common with me. The dreams that interested me, the dreams that I took inspiration from, whether in the sense of a literal dream or things I encountered in the real world when I was awake that I fastened onto and thought about or fantasized about, or that I aspired to imitate or learn from. Those things shaped the development of my intelligence, and they became what other people now perceive as my intelligence. And by the same token, I never learned to drive a car. I never learned to play any musical instrument. And if the example of wanting to become a wrestler, say women's Olympic wrestling, if that's a little bit too hard for you guys to visualize, just imagine how different my whole life would be if I had learned a musical instrument. And let's not say I was a rock star or terribly famous, but if I had just learned to play the guitar and I'd played in a local band in downtown Toronto, the way that would have shaped my teenage years and my college years and my development, it would have changed where I was spending time, what I was reading, probably just wouldn't have been reading books. It would have changed the women I was sleeping with and, my sexual and social development. It probably would have involved me in drugs and alcohol in a different way or for a different length of time. My youth and my development into adulthood all would have been unbelievably different if I had learned to play guitar. And I don't even mean that I became a successful guitarist. I knew other kids when I was a teenager. If I just started doing kind of open mic nights and battle of the bands and small local gigs, if I started doing shows that 100 people attended, 500 people attended, which in downtown Toronto at that time was quite easy to do. It's quite a lively local scene for gigs on a small scale that way. And of course, if you got up to the level of doing an audience of 5,000 or actually making money out of it, then your life would change immeasurably in those directions for those reasons. So what we talk about with intelligence, whether you're looking at the final product or the first impulses that lead you to that final product, is something so evanescent. It's something so unreal and so impalpable that's the product of circumstances and cultural institutions, like whether or not you have access to a library and what kind of education you have. It's linked to all these things in such a powerful way. One of my brothers was a guitarist as his career. That was the main thing he did his whole life, from early teenage years or from childhood into old age. All these guys are old men now. I'm the youngest, so they're all older than me. There's no sense in which I can say that our genetic kinship is more powerful in shaping who we were and who we've become than the difference between the fact that he became deeply engrossed in the guitar, and that led to certain kinds of women he pursued and certain kinds of women who pursued him, and a certain lifestyle, and all these things, all the things bundled up with being a guitarist. I can remember seeing him when he'd wake up in the morning, and the first thing he'd do before he ate breakfast was get out his guitar and start playing his guitar. Obviously this was decades and decades into his career, but still the fundamental discipline that guitar brought to his life, and from my perspective also the fundamental lack of discipline, that he was someone who never developed an interest in political reality. This is a profound shaping influence on his life, from childhood through adulthood. There's no way I can look at the DNA we have in common as being more powerful and more important in shaping who he became than that choice he made to play guitar, and the series of choices I made, some of which I can remember as very clear and distinct choices, and some of which are wrapped up in all kinds of contradictory emotions for why I was drawn to care about certain things and drawn to read about certain things and develop myself in a different way. So in this sense, yeah, I can spend time with my daughter and I can be shocked at how much we have in common. And again, the time we spend together is so little due to this lousy court decision in France, but whatever. And, on the other hand, I can look at my own parents, my own brothers and sisters, and see how little we have in common. And that allows me a lens to challenge, or it leads me, it incentivizes me to challenge what so many people today seem to feel is a very compelling argument in favor of racism, in favor of scientistic racism specifically, in favor of the theory that the progress of history, for example, Europe's domination over Africa in the colonial period, Europe's genocide in North America and South America, not to mention Australia, another one, genocidal imperialism, that this can to some extent be morally justified, explained, and even valorized as an innate and hereditary difference produced by unequal levels of IQ, unequal levels of genetic intelligence. So these things may be easy to believe in, and they may be appealing for people to believe in. And it's in a sense much more humbling, or genuinely even humiliating, to look at yourself and look at your brother and realize, hey, the fact that you watched music videos on MTV, the fact that you listened to some albums on LP, and you decided you wanted to be like that guy, you wanted to be like that guitarist, you wanted to live that life, and you were going to work so hard. I remember my brother, he didn't have a teacher, he didn't have lessons or anything. He taught himself how to play the guitar. That you were going to go to the library and get those books and sit down next to the radio and practice and try to do the same guitar lines from that song. You had that vision, you had that dream, and you poured your talent into it. That's really determined, the kind of man you are and what we now perceive as intelligence. And the fact that I didn't, or that I found that repulsive, that I moved away from that, the sense that everything we value as intelligence may rise and fall with something so seemingly trivial, something so shallow, something that's even less palpable than your bloodline. That's maybe quite a scary thing to realize. And maybe if we took it seriously, it would inspire all of us to not waste our time playing video games, or not waste our time doing downhill skiing, or maybe even not waste our time playing guitar or listening to music, but we'd realize the extent to which these choices and how we discipline ourselves and what we do with our minds, the dreams we have and how we respond to them, how we adopt a type of discipline or lifestyle in response to our dreams, in response to things we take inspiration from, that is much, much more powerful than the blood that when we're born happens to be flowing in our veins.